I'm Adam from the Digital Soup Podcast, a proud member of the Gonna Geek Network, just like the show you're listening to now. The opinions expressed are those of each individual. Check out all the other podcasts at gonnageek.com and get ready because geekiness begins in 3, 2, 1.
This is episode number 123 of Better Podcasting. Today, we get to know our audiences.
In this week's Better Podcasting download, we describe how our audiences are listening to us.
And finally, in this week's Better Podback, we run down what our audience has to say to us.
Lauren, let's give this audience a show. And no, not that type of show, SP.
I'm crushed.
Welcome to Better Podcasting, a show where we talk about podcast tips, tools, and best practices to help you succeed with your podcast. What makes us different? Well, just like you, we podcast purely out of the love and fun of it. Podcasting is our hobby, and we recognize that it's yours too. We always encourage your questions and feedback, and you can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. Here's your host for the show, Stephen John Drew and Stargate Pioneer.
Welcome to an all-new episode of Better Podcasting, episode 123. I am the cold burr, Stephen John Drew, and with me, of course, is the cold Stargate Pioneer.
I'm suffering through a voice issue tonight for our audience. This is me dedicated to our podcast because I'm the one that's always here and I'm the one who's never gotten fired yet.
That's true. But yes, we are here to talk about the latest in the world of podcasting. If you never checked us out before, we do like to talk about podcasting from a different angle. We try to look at things from more of like the hobbyist angle. So we try to leave a lot of the money talk out of it, contrary to last week's episode. So please do, if you do like the show, please do check us out any of the ways. We have an audio version, which you are maybe listening to us right now, but did you know that we have a full video companion as well, which you can always find at betterpodcasting.com, or like this show, you can find at betterpodcasting.com/123, and that's where you can find all of the details as well, like the show details, so links and stuff like that. So check that out at betterpodcasting.com. SP, before we get into our topic today, I have a question for you.
Quest.
Has it not been a while since we've gotten a How I Saved My Podcast story?
It has indeed been a while since we've received a How I Saved My Podcast story from our audience.
Which, if you're not familiar with this, by the way, what it is we encourage you to tell us how exactly have you made your podcast run because something went wrong and you saved it. You can always let us know through any of the ways that you can reach us, which is available, of course, at betterpodcasting.com. You can also go ahead and tweet us at betterpod or email podcast@betterpodcasting.com. As I mentioned, we have a video show, so feel free to link us to a video or just go ahead and send us an audio clip too. That works also, but let us know, how have you saved your podcast so everybody else can learn from your mistake? I mean, your genius.
Well, they saved their podcast, so it's not necessarily a mistake at that point in time. It is a genius save. It's like the goalie save in hockey in overtime when they're doing the shootout and you're saving the goal and you're saving the game. That's what we're talking about. So it is you being a hero to your own show and to your own audience.
Let's be honest, you love podcasting. Well, you kind of have to because you're listening to a podcast that podcasts about podcasting. So that means that you must love podcasting. And whether you're just interested in the topic of podcasting as a hobby or if you want to grow your show, ultimately you are making the show, guess what? Probably not for you. It's probably for your audience because they're the ones that are listening. Now, yes, you might like doing it yourself and that might be a driving factor, but ultimately they're the ones that's listening. So your audience is your boss in a lot of ways. And if your audience doesn't like your show, the odds are they're not going to listen to it. I know that's shocking information, right? if new listeners don't like your show, they're not going to subscribe to it either. So if you know who your audience is, this is hopefully going to retain that listenership a little bit better, and you can make content that is going to pique their interest and also keep those listeners and hold on to those new ones and make them hit that subscribe button. And this is why it's very important to know who your audience is. And that's what we're talking about today, is knowing who your audience is, what the benefits are, and how you can know who they are. Right, SB?
Yeah. So first we're going to talk about how you can know who your audience is. And it's important to approach this from multiple directions, because just one way to get to know your audience isn't going to be the full picture. It's just like going out on a date with somebody. If you just go on one date with them, you're not going to know who they are. A lot of people say you have to go through 2 holiday seasons with your significant other before you're ready for a lifetime commitment. Well, the same is true of a podcast audience. It can't just be a quick question that they answer or meeting them in person just once. This is a multiple ongoing thing, and it really gets to define your audience better and better along the way. So we're going to run down some different ways on how you can get to know your audience, and then how that might apply to you creating content later. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about feedback. So ask people to chime in to your show, and when they do, respond to it, right? Just don't have them send something and then nothing is there. I subscribe, as you know, Stephen, to a lot of live aboard sailing YouTube channels, and to a T, every single one of them, when I leave a comment on their YouTube channel, they either give me a heart or they respond. They generally respond to me because I'm asking an in-depth question. The same is true of you as a podcaster. If somebody is giving you feedback, make sure you engage with them and make sure that they know you care. And then if you can, this is a little bit of the getting to know your audience, take note of who is responding, any demographics you can gather from that, and then internalize that. You could even write it down in a spreadsheet, but most hobby podcasters, you're just going to get a good idea of who they are from how they respond over time. And then if you get a massive audience, you can start to delve a little bit more into that. But that's the first thing. Make sure that you run through the feedback that's given to you, ask for it, and then respond to it and take note of who's responding.
Another way that you can find out who your audience is, and this one here, getting out of your social comfort zone a little bit, is in-person meetups. This will take more work, but if you do know that your audience is going to be somewhere, maybe that's something that you're going to be able to meet them face to face and get to know them a little bit better. Sometimes it's even piggybacking on another event that you know that audience is going to be at. Maybe they're going to an event about a central theme and you want to put it out there that you want to hold a little mini meet for your specific audience members. So that is another way that you can find out who your audience is. And also when you do meet them, same thing we mentioned before, take note of who they are. And that can be like finding out how old they are, what are they also interested in besides your show and the topics on your show, and are they diverse or similar to each other? And also, sometimes you can find some other information about them, like their listening habits, because you're just in a topic of a conversation. You can sometimes pull all sorts of data out of them, just like you can also pull data out of listener survey results, which is another way that you can find these demographics out, right, SB?
Yeah, so you can create a listener survey out of, SurveyMonkey or Google Sheet or something. It doesn't have to be a dedicated advertisement firm or a poll taking firm or anything like that. You can do it on your own, and you set up a survey. Now, I know Libsyn actually does podcast surveys too, but they want a high response rate in order for it to be statistically relevant. So I don't know if most hobby podcasts with 500 listeners or less is going to qualify for that, but you can get great data from any survey. And this can be targeted through like email lists, or it could be on your website. And it could even just be in your show notes and encourage people to respond to the questions. And it can be super focused or it can be broad. It depends on what you're looking at and what you want to know. And you can ask general genre questions. You can say, hey, if you don't know your audience at all, Do you like apples or oranges? You can start from there, and then you can get more and more specific as time goes on. It's a unique opportunity to know specific things about your audience, especially if you get enough responses, like I said before, to be statistically relevant.
Absolutely. While we're on that data train, let's talk about another obvious way that you can hopefully get this information is diving in, or delving in if you want to use the term properly, but I prefer diving into show listening / download statistics and demographics. Now, whether this is your media host or your stats provider, or if you've got a website, the web server information, these can all tell you valuable information about that listener. They can tell you where people are listening to, when they're listening to it. As well, you can sort of surmise what type of person they are. For example, if you do see a large amount of traffic coming from a certain direction, you know that that person is probably finding you through the internet, and you can extrapolate a little bit of data from that. So it's definitely something that use these tools. If you've got them somewhere, step back and think to yourself, how does this reflect on my listener base, and what can I pull from this data?
That is a common theme as we go forward. Make sure that you're internalizing this data, and maybe you're keeping a Word document or a Google Doc somewhere where you're compiling all this information, because as you go and create content, which we'll talk about later, this is all important. Going to keep hitting that over and over again. Another way that you can grab data from your audience is by doing fun polls. We do it all the time on Better Podcasting, where we throw a Twitter poll out there, sometimes with 2 hours left before showtime, sometimes it runs the whole week. And we just try to know what you think and what you are doing. First of all, it informs us on what's prevalent in the pod sphere, but also it tells us what we should be concentrating on in terms of topics. Like if we see a certain capability that would help hobby podcasters, but hobby podcasters on a whole aren't using it, then we could talk about it on our show and get it out there for people to try in their shows, and that would help them. So that's just an example for us, but you can run fun polls on, if you're doing a comic book show, who's the best superhero? Is it Iron Man or is it Batman? Or if you're doing a woodworking show, what's the best type of varnish, right, Stephen? What's the best type of varnish?
Absolutely. That's the poll that I would put up. And then you can know that your listenership is very uneducated if they believe that a varnish is something that, yeah. Anyways, next topic that we've got here is going to be contest entries. Contest entries are one that we've actually found ourselves to be very helpful to getting to know our audience a little bit. We have obviously run contests on this show, and if you've never checked that out before, or never heard about that before, well, guess what? We do run contests from time to time on this show. Have you ever noticed how on Better Podcasting, we sometimes tie those contests to a certain question? We ask people to submit them. Well, obviously, it's partly to create content, but another part of it is just to get to know you a little bit better. So if we do ask you, what was your favorite episode of 2017? And all of a sudden we have a bunch of people saying it was that time that Steven got fired, we know that either you really don't like me, or you like to have fun like we do. And so that's it's probably the former. Let's be totally honest on that. It's probably the former, right, SB?
This can work for other things as well. It's not just our contests. I've ran contests on Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Starling Tribune, and we always try to gather some data. Also, you can use them to try to get a little more followers in Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever. But the most important thing, at least for this show that we're doing right here, this episode, is to gather more data. So it's always good to know like who their favorite superhero is on Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. or what's your favorite episode of Arrow over on Starling Tribune. So it starts into that area of getting to know your audience and what they care about. So then you can focus on what they care about, or tell them about something else that's really relevant that they might not know about. Another area that we've been very fortunate to grab both just content from and interactivity is a live chat room, right, Stephen?
Yeah, the chat room's fun because we've talked briefly, actually, maybe even, a whopping 2 episodes ago, we talked about how the chat rooms can sometimes go a little bit off of the topic that's being discussed. What's nice about that is that you can, again, see what they're interested in, because while you might be talking about topic A on your show right now, they're listening to you, but in the chat, they're also talking with other people about topic C. And so that lets you know that they're talking about something else and they have another shared interest. As well, you can sometimes have a little bit of extra fun with them by that live chat and interact with them a little bit more and get to know them, because you obviously want to stay on point with your show. But if you got this live chat room going, now you can go off topic with your audience while still maintaining your on pointness. That's a term, right? Your on pointness for your podcast.
That must be a Canadian technical term then, on pointness. Another thing that you could do with a live show is do a post show. We like to do that from time to time here. We don't always do it because one of us has to go sometimes, but this is a fun part of the show because you're off from actually recording your show, but you're still on with your audience. So it's different with a listener to interact with you when you're off. It's like an after show, like you have a play, right? And then you go out with each other later and you're not doing the play thing anymore, but you're having fun together. That's the sort of things. And you can get to know your audience and what they like to do for fun regarding your activity in the post show. And even it's not as active as we like, we might not actually pull people from the chat room into the show, but we like to have people in part of this conversation. Such as what movie did they see this week, such as what side interest items that they have going on, which might actually relate, in our case, to podcasting or your show, whatever the topic of your show is. And then you can talk about it in the future, and then you can garner more interest in your show from somebody new.
For sure. The next one that we've got here, it generally doesn't happen while you're recording, but more so happens in between your recordings, is something that I'm not familiar with. So I'll let SP talk about. Never heard about this in my life before. It must be a new website. Patreon. Patreon. Sorry.
Oh, I thought you were going to go to Patreon, especially since it was recently St. Patrick's Day, so St. Patty's Day.
St. Patreon. Wow, that wasn't even an Irish accent.
You have no hope, sir. So yeah, Patreon is a great place because you post specifically to your core supporters and they will interact with you. Oftentimes, what I've seen with Patreon is you'll get extra content or content early or both. And that way your Patreon members can interact with you regarding that content and you can get special feedback from them because first of all, they're going to be engaged because they're actually giving you money. That's why they're in your Patreon page, but also because they have interest in the topic to begin with. So you might get a lot of great interaction on Patreon that is not necessarily with the rest of your external facing YouTube channels or your podcast website, your Twitter, your Facebook group, whatever you have. So this is a special interaction to pay attention to because if you want to grow your show, you want to have more core listeners. So if you can have more people like the types of conversations you're having in Patreon, take hold of that data because those are the type of people that you want to appeal to.
For sure. The next one that we've got here is one that takes a little bit more work, but it can definitely be a good return on investment, is investing in one-on-one messages with people. These are some of my favorite ways to get to know my audience. They send me an email and I fire them back a response. I have talked about it on here before. So many different relationships have been made from podcasting and just simply responding to people's messages that come in and just taking that time. You never know where a listener is going to do this with you either. It could be an email, but it could be something like you're on the podcast forum or you're sitting there on Reddit. You never know where you're going to find that listener and they're going to shoot you a message. And then it's really worth delving into that conversation with them and really getting to know them, because that again is going to give you information about who your audience is.
Another thing you can do is just pay attention to other communities. So topic related, but not necessarily in your podcast sphere. So you can go to Reddit, a forum maybe, or Facebook groups or somewhere that a lot of people are regarding your topic. Arrow, again, I'll bring that up. There's a very active Reddit Arrow sub, and it's overactive in my opinion, but these are people that care. They watch the show and then they talk about it. They might rag on it at no end, but they still are watching the show. So it's important to take their thoughts into consideration, especially if you're podcasting on it. And this doesn't have to be comic book related. This could be sports team related. This could be topic related. If you happen to be podcasting about politics, there's a ton of groups out there about that. It could be religion. I mean, whatever your topic is that you are podcasting on, odds are there's some sort of community that you can take in data from that and then start to garner, this is my ideal listener. I need to know them from an audience perspective and appeal to them. So take into consideration potential new listeners in your community as well.
All right, this one here, I gotta say, is intriguing, and I think a lot of people have heard of this, but there's a good chunk of people that haven't as well. But you could do something like have your listeners send in pictures of themselves and where they're listening to your show, because this is gonna not only make a better connection with them, and you can kind of see a little bit about them, and you can get all those demographics we talked about, but also you can see where they're actually listening to this. So if all of a sudden you see everybody is mowing their lawn while they're listening to you, you know that that's generally where you're listened to, is when they're mowing their lawn, and you might want to sit there and talk a little bit more clearly, right?
And maybe release your podcasts at like a higher loudness, perceived loudness levels, or loose as we've called them before. Yeah, you want to know that. And again, we said it before, I'm going to say it again. This is not the sole thing. Don't ask people to send in your pictures and then assume that's your entire audience. Some people might not be comfortable sending in pictures to anybody that is podcast related in this era of people wanting to maintain their privacy, especially digitally. So you got to take that into consideration and then look at other forms of information that you can get from your audience to get a more holistic picture.
Absolutely.
It's a picture.
I saw what you did there. It was pretty funny, and I chose not to comment on it because you're sick. So there you go. Also, get a little bit analytical. Yes, we talked a little bit before about actually getting into the analytics of your show, but have you stepped back and looked and said, oh, I'm seeing the same audience across multiple of my shows, and then I can extrapolate who these people are because of the different overlap that they've got. Definitely this is a way that you can really see who your audience is if you look at where you're seeing these common threads between shows. As well, if you have website statistics, you can look into these actual data points to find out information like search algorithms and things like that. And it might tell you even some referrers, which is generally the links, that it's the information that says this person came from this website. And that can also help you figure out who these people are, because if they're all coming from that Arrow Reddit that SB spoke about, well, you know that they're all Redditors.
And it would be important to engage over there too. Another thing that can happen that you can get to know your audience is ask them on your show if circumstances allow for it. So if you want to get to know that listener way better, there's no better way than to actually have a conversation with them. I will warn you not to get too private in details. You want to keep it high level, just like you would on any social media platform. So you don't want to delve into their personal lives or anything, unless that's what your show is talking about. But this is a way that you can get to know your listeners, and you can have multiple listeners on your show as well. That's how I got into podcasting, is I was a listener on a podcast, and that podcast had me on, and then the hook was set and I wanted to podcast for the rest of my life. So there is that aspect of it as well. But that podcast got to know me and got to know a lot more of me. And then they got to know their audience, or at least a portion of their audience, and then they wanted more of me. So then they needed to create more content that would appeal to me.
All right. So these are a bunch of different ways that you can find out who your audience is. And we now want to talk about how you can use this data. So no matter how you're obtaining all this information, once you do know who they are, you want to remember, again, what we mentioned, you're essentially creating your show for them. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about that. Here's an example. Let's say that your audience is listening to your topic because they find you funny. Guess what? Is something that you should do, is you should encourage yourself to be a little bit funny. As well, you should probably hire Johnny Pennington, our loyal listener, to give you advice on how to be funny.
And comedic coaching, basically. Yeah, Johnny Pennington would be great at that. And if your audience just wants the facts about a topic, do the research, be detailed, and just give them the facts without going off into sarcastic, joking manner like we tend to do on this show. But if you want to get into specifics on a scientific topic, maybe money or something that's really important, you don't want to be joking around at that point in time. Mental health, that would be another case where you wouldn't necessarily want to be joking around a lot. So if they want the facts about a topic, make sure you give them the facts. And if your audience wants to be told a story, make sure you're telling them a story every week. Make sure you're not just giving them the information, giving the facts. Walk them through it. Make it interesting from them. Illustrate what this could be to them. So make that story. And that's not the only thing. There's other things that you can do with that information, right, Stephen?
Absolutely. For example, if your audience is age specific, you probably want to bring in age specific content. Now, this is something that, like, for example, if you've got an audience that's nearing the 40 realms, well, maybe you want to talk about the 20th high school reunion, or if it's a college age audience, you want to talk about those 21st birthday celebration, or, if you're in other countries like Canada, the 19th birthday celebration. So these are all ways that you could use that age demographic in order to tailor and connect a little bit better with your audience. Also, do they have a shared secondary interest? For example, maybe you find out through all of these talking that you've got an audience that shares the passion of drone flying. Okay, that's an example in here right now because SP is all about the drone flying, by the way. So those drone flyers, you might end up finding as well, have a secondary interest to photography. So that's another connection that you could make and use that depending on the nature of your show.
Sailboat living is another great example, because if you're living on a sailboat, odds are you like to be in or around the water, specifically the ocean. So they might be interested in the topic of scuba diving. So you might want to talk about scuba diving in addition to living on board a sailboat and keeping that going as your home. Are you interested, if you're podcasting, about renewable energy? Not only is the technology of renewable energy of interest, but you're probably also going to be interested in the environment. So that's going to be a go-to topic of interest as well. There's just some examples of primary topics that you're podcasting on, and then nice secondary topics that you can throw into your episodes, or maybe dedicated whole episodes to along the way. Now, if most of your audience is in a forum or a Discord channel or a Facebook group, you should bring up those conversations that you're having with the audience into the podcast on a weekly basis, or depending on how often you release your show. Often, basically, you want to make sure you're including the audience and those topics, because those topics are of interest to your audience. And if somebody on a Facebook group multiple somebodies are having the same conversation with you, odds are the rest of your audience wants to know about that too. So that is something to take into consideration.
Consider the fact, is your audience looking for new and innovative ways to look at this information? So what you could do is search the space and bring in interviews that are of interest to your audience. For example, you could maybe bring in that wonderful Andrew Scott from the Podcastage YouTube channel as well, with his 1 million viewers that come with it.
1 million views. I don't know if he's necessarily got 1 million viewers.
No, he's got 1 million viewers.
Okay. Well, the point is he talks about microphones. So here on our podcast, we know that hobby podcasters like to talk about microphones because they want to achieve the maximum sound that they could get for the money. So it's good to have Andrew Scott on. Also, if you just want a general interest, having Jason Bryant on, which has a cool story of being an Olympic sports announcer for wrestling. Oh, by the way, he's also a prolific podcaster. So he's great to have on board just to talk about that interest and the podcasting. And if you want to talk about going from being a very accomplished hobby podcaster to a professional in the podcasting sphere, yeah, that's good to have Emily Prokop on. So yeah, these interviews just didn't come out of nowhere, or having these people on the podcast just didn't come out of nowhere for Better Podcasting. We actually had them on the podcast to illustrate a point, and I think we've done that so far.
And we bribed them lots of money.
That's true.
Also, you can extrapolate if your audience prefers a certain delivery style because of who they are. For example, let's say you find out that your audience is really not that technical. Well, the odds are when you start to talk about something technical, you're going to want to expand on it a little bit and maybe give a little bit more basic information before you get into your main point. Or on the flip side, if they are super technological, well, then maybe that's something that you just want to go ahead and brush over that information and just get straight to the meat. So that is something that you can do as well. Could even be the matter of you find that your audience is a certain demographic where you need to speak a little bit slower or enunciate a little bit more. It just depends on the situation. And of course, if you end up making it so that your audience can actually understand you, you have a better chance of them listening and staying with you than if they didn't understand you at all.
And maybe it's not just understanding you. Maybe you just need to do a better job of explaining what you are and what your podcast is. For example, if you get to know that your audience largely found you by accident and that you were different than they originally assumed, this could tell you maybe you have a lack of marketing and maybe your marketing is misguided. So maybe you need to refocus that promotional aspect of your podcast.
Also, are you even referencing your audience in your show? For example, we here have mentioned on Better Podcasting, we have an audio and a video side to our show. If in the show we only talked about the listener, that would exclude our video viewer, which is definitely a part of our show. Or on the flip side, if we just constantly said, so yeah, you can see this thing here and on this thing here, then that's going to exclude our audience or our audio listener, and they're going to be completely lost and think that we're just ignoring them. So you can definitely make sure that you're referencing your audience.
And finally, if there's something that you might want to avoid talking about on your show because it might cause a lot of controversy, yeah, that would be important to note too. Matter of fact, I was listening to this podcast. I'm going to get a little geeky here, but I was listening to the Star Wars podcast, part of their online community on their Discord channel. And I kept on bringing up that I was a fan of this character, Mara Jade. And apparently I didn't know this, but Mara Jade is actually very controversial in the Star Wars universe. So they don't talk about Mara Jade on their podcast specifically for that reason. And there's a lot of issues into that. I won't get into what causes the controversy, but it's there, it's real. And if you don't want to alienate half your listeners, you just don't talk about it.
Absolutely. So there you go. Today we've talked about getting to know your audience and getting all cozy with them and how you can use that to make your show better. If you've got ways that you've gotten to know your audience, please do let us know. You can get in touch with us through a variety of ways. You can go ahead and tweet us at BetterPod. You can find us at facebook.com/betterpodcasting or email podcast@betterpodcasting.com and tell us a little bit about yourself while you're sending that, because then we will know you a little bit better, and then we can make it into a spreadsheet and we can pour over that spreadsheet and we can analyze statistics. I mean, we can get to know you.
For the record, Better Podcasting does not currently have said spreadsheet. For the record,
SP doesn't know about said spreadsheet. But let's go ahead and move on to the Better Podcasting download.
Welcome to this week's Better Podcasting download.
Or is it downloads today, plural?
that's right. We got two of them. By the way, 2 weeks ago, we talked about some podcast industry statistics, and we said that we were going to get back to you in a couple weeks on something else. Well, the Edison Research, the Infinite Dial 2018 came out on March 8th. 2018. There was a Facebook presentation, but you can find all the slides available at edisonresearch.com/infinite-dial-2018. That's where all this information came from. Now, the study is an annual study. We talked about it before. Matter of fact, I think this is our third year of talking about it. And As this year, as each of the two previous years, a total of 2,000 persons were interviewed to explore Americans, which does include Canada, I believe, use of digital platforms and new media. From January 4th through February 11th, 2018, they were conducted by telephone interviews, and the respondents were aged 12 and older, who were selected from a random digit dial, or RDD, sampling through both landline phones and now mobile phones, which I hate those telemarketer calls on my mobile phone, by the way. So the 2018 Infinite Dial study is the latest report, and this study goes back to 1998. We've talked about it for the last 3 years, but this has been going on for 20 years now. And it covers consumer usage of media and technology, and it's tracked many new platforms along the way as they develop and redefine the media landscape. And this year's report spotlights a few things of growth of smart home speakers, voice controlled devices, such as Amazon Echo and Google Home. We'll get to that in a second. So that was the setup directly from their website. Now, it was 66 different slides. I'm not going to go through all 66 of them, but I am going to go through several different things that are relevant specifically to the hobby podcaster. The first thing is smartphone ownership is up 2%. And it went from 81% to 83%. And pretty much this has grown over the years. And just my personal opinion, and you can kind of see it start to top off in the statistics, by the way, it is going to top off, level off, because you're never going to get 100%. You're never going to get, especially as how expensive these things are, you're never going to get to the point where everybody's going to have a smartphone. Some people like to live off the grid. Some people can't afford it, that sort of thing. So will it get higher than 83%? Probably, but I don't know when that top off is going to be. The important thing is make sure your podcast is accessible on a mobile device. So the next thing I want to bring up is that smart speaker ownership is up, I would say statistically significant, but it's still a minority. It went up 11% from 7% to 18%. This is indeed growing. I wouldn't ignore it, but I wouldn't focus on it. It's only at 18%. Even those that have one don't necessarily listen to podcasts on it. And I think you'll find that. Matter of fact, we're going to talk about cars in a little bit, but remember a few years ago, Stephen, where cars were the big thing, right? And listening to podcasts through a car app on the dashboard was a big thing. Well, that's turned out to be not so much the case. And I think we might be headed there with the smart home speakers. Now, should you ignore it? No, by no means should you ignore it. Matter of fact, Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. now has an Amazon skill that you can download and listen to that podcast there. So I'm not ignoring it, but I wouldn't focus on it. I would focus on other ways to make sure your podcast is searchable and listenable. Okay, Facebook usage. I wasn't going to throw this in there, but since I was kicked off of Facebook, I'm going to talk about it. It is down. Facebook usage is down 5% to 62%. To that, I say, I wonder why, because they kick people off like me.
You know, part of it too, though, I think is the shift that we're seeing with Facebook, like the fact that Facebook has changed some of their algorithms to try to make it a little bit less business oriented and a lot less business oriented and a lot more interactive. So I think that's going to be one of the reasons why it's down, because let's be honest, Facebook didn't just do that because they want to get all personal. They did it because that's what their market research showed. So if people are not sticking around and willing to go into these clips and whatnot, and they want to have more of just the one-on-one interaction, then of course the odds of the listenership is going to be down, right?
Yeah, that's as far as I'm going to go on Facebook right now. We'll track this trend next year and see if it stabilizes, goes down, or goes up. It'll be something to continue to watch. Still, it's at 62%. That is more than statistically relevant. So you should probably have some sort of presence over on Facebook, or at least interact some way over on Facebook, unless, of course, Facebook kicks you off. Another thing that came out of this Infinite Dial study in 2018 is the top 3 streaming services. And this is just not podcasts. This is like all audio streaming, mostly music. So the top 3 are Pandora, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. So based on this, because Pandora doesn't really open themselves to podcasts, I think it's important for you to try to have your podcast on iHeartRadio and Spotify. And I do believe that there are methods to get your podcast on both of those through any means. Like there's an online form that you can apply for both of them. So make sure that you're applying for them in the appropriate places. Or if you happen to be on Podbean or Libsyn that might have some automatic destinations set up, go ahead and use those. Spotify and iHeartRadio are important to be on because they are really head streaming services. And I know iHeartRadio just declared bankruptcy like a couple of weeks ago, or said that they were in financial trouble. I get that, but I think they're going to restructure and they're going to be still strong on the other side, but we'll see in 2 to 5 years. It's not SoundCloud level doom and gloom, but it's something to keep your eye on. Until then, it's still a place to have your podcast on.
Which, by the way, let's just throw that out here. What you don't know, listeners, is that the GonnaGeek.com show was very lazy with being submitted to iHeartRadio. And then we did submit to iHeartRadio and we got on iHeartRadio. And it was like the next day they declared bankruptcy. So clearly they're just trying to shake our tail. So that's the way that is. We
You're
make
just bragging now. You're bragging.
You know what? Sometimes in life, there's good shows and then there's shows that make other companies go bankrupt. And I like to think we're the latter.
Well, it's a Canadian-based show, so I wouldn't be surprised. The next Infinite Dial fact is that weekly YouTube usage is up 3% from 43% to 46%. This is starting to get to the point where you might want to consider a video companion to your podcast. There's just a lot of people on YouTube. And if you can get the correct SEO, I would go ahead and do that. Now, I've seen some controversy of whether you should put a static image with an audio file up on YouTube or not. That's one of the reasons why you see our faces here, by the way, is we don't think that that is good long-term for SEO, for interaction back and forth. So you want to have a live face on it. Now, is this all possible to everybody? Like if you don't have a good internet connection, it's not going to be possible. But you could record a video podcast, kind of like what Bandrew does with Bandrew Says, and then upload it and have it available to people as well. So I think we're at the point where you have to consider video in some way, shape, manner, or form with YouTube, especially with the searchability and SEO. I talked about cars before. Infinite Dial says that podcasts are only 3% of the audio sources listened to most often in a car. Now, this is not through your smartphone device. This is not through your iPod. This is through the actual car dashboard, and only 3%. So this is what I'm saying, and it's not really important for you to have an app on the dashboard of the car. It's more important for you to be available on mobile devices than make sure you're in the car. And this goes back to the smart home speakers. Is it going to be important to be on the smart home speakers or not? Well, it's growing, but it could end up like cars too. And it could end up retracting and something else could take its place, like mobile devices instead of those static home smart devices. Podcasts continue to grow. The podcast familiarity of people that just know the term podcasting is up 4% from 60% to 64%. This has been growing dramatically. Of course, podcast is it's like 15 years old. I think eventually that's going to level off and it's never going to be 100% as well, just because not everybody is going to listen to podcasts. Not everybody watches TV these days either, by the way, Stephen. So it's what you get. And 64% is pretty good. Will that probably go up? Yeah. Especially when you're talking, what is it? Alex and Company, that new sitcom that's starting on, Fox or ABC or something like that, about podcasting. You're just getting more familiarity in the mainstream media and people are going to know the term podcast, but they might not check it out. So just keep that in mind. And then podcast listening for those people that have ever listened to a podcast has gone up 4% from 40% to 44%. So that's important. 64% know what podcasting is, but only 44% have ever listened to a podcast. So it's in mainstream media, but that recognition doesn't help listenership all that much. This is the one that I'm going to hit. This is the biggest takeaway of the Infinite Dial 2018, and it's been the biggest takeaway the last couple of years. mobile devices continue to grow for podcast listening. It's up 4% from 65% to 69%. So make sure you're on podcatcher apps and make sure your website is mobile friendly. This is not new. We've been saying this for years. So make sure your podcast is able to be consumed and searched on a mobile device. And this is also important, by the way, Stephen. I know you listen to podcasts at 4 times speed. Well, not everybody does. Matter of fact, only 19% speed up podcast listening speed. So don't optimize your podcast for that 1.5 to 2 times speed just yet, because you're going to be leaving out 81% of your audience that you sound weird at 1x because you've optimized for 2x.
Absolutely, which is why I'm going to stop talking like this.
I thought that was because you were a Canadian and you were inherently slow.
That too, and we're frozen. I think there's a lot of really good data points in there, and as usual, you did a really good job of extracting what is important and why it's important. So if you want, you can definitely check this whole thing out. You can use the full long link that SP said, or the short one is geeks.link/dial2018. That will take you right over there. And I want to say that I think it's always good, even as a hobby podcaster, to keep a pulse on this, because you want to make your show the best that it can be for the audience, and you can get some good general observations out of this research, especially when you kind of step back and you look at all of these different data reports that come out this time of year. So thanks for doing that, SP. I really appreciate that.
I just took the hit for our listener, for our audience, and it's just interesting to me too. So there you go. You're getting it because I'm interested in it.
Secondly, and lastly, in the Better Podcasting Download, this is just a little quick hit for you here. SP, say what? Say caster. Whoa, I see what I did there. Yeah, apparently there's, I know, shocking information. A new podcast host service coming out of the world of podcasting. We've seen this on and off over the last few years. As more and more people get into podcasting, there's more potential of money, or more people trying to get some of that money. And so, of course, if they can try to take a bite out of this media host or just this podcast world, then you're going to see more and more of these things come up. Now, Sadecaster is interesting from one perspective, is that this startup is trying to really reimagine podcasting and make it a little bit more social in one spot. The idea with Sadecaster is that it allows podcasters to put, quote, spots, end quote, to specific moments within their podcasts that's going to allow listeners to engage and discuss around that. Now, the CEO said, the idea came to us when we realized how painfully old-fashioned and clunky the podcast experience truly was. When the reference is that, like, when a podcaster mentions a tweet or an article, they want to see it so that when somebody is listening to it, it doesn't just automatically appear on their listening device. That's what they want it to happen, is they want it so that people are able to get that information right away, rather than you having to go over to betterpodcasting.com/123 to get all of those links. Now, key features of this platform is going to include the spots, of course, which will be 5 to 20 spots. It's also going to allow listeners to comment on these specific spots and interact with other listeners. Now, there is a dedicated Apple as well as an Android app in the works for Sadecaster, which of course is pretty important if you want to have people be able to use these spots. So this is something that it hasn't hit public beta yet, but if you want to check that out and get things going and get in the line, you can go to sadecaster.com. I'm just going to go into my opinion here, and I think that it's a very ambitious idea. And while I think that it would be kind of cool if they had success, I just don't see it when you're trying to revolutionize an entire industry. We've seen a lot of requests from some pretty big names to really expand the RSS feed and some of the tags within there, and we can't even do that. You're expecting to make consumers, the ones that are just the general public, try to adopt this way. I don't know that I see it if we can't even get the techie podcast creators to make a change.
Yeah, you're going to get more and more big names interested in podcasting because there's a lot of interest and a lot of monetization that's capable of doing it. And that's part of the why we're doing Better Podcasting, is to keep an eye on the industry infrastructure and how it would apply to a hobby podcaster. And in this particular case, I think Google's starting to wake up. We'll see what happens, but they made a statement this past week that they're looking at a unified app to play podcasts on their devices on the Droid OS. And we'll see if that happens. But if that happens, and then you have the iOS issues, and then, as you said, they have different ID3 tags that are necessary between them, and then you throw something like this or Art19 or something like that that's doing monetization in specific formats, all of a sudden your podcast, just like TV shows these days, not be ubiquitous in where you can get them, because some TV shows you can't get on Netflix. You might have to get them on Hulu. You might have to get them on Amazon Prime. And apparently that's working for them. But I think podcasts aren't big enough yet where you can really show your audience where you are if you start to limit where they can get it.
Yeah, and I think with something like Saycaster, you're going to see it used like we see a lot of new services, like Spotify and TuneIn and all these other places that aren't necessarily traditional podcasts, is you're going to be using it as a secondary distribution method. It's something you might encourage people to go over and check out if they want to comment. But I don't think you're ever going to see the big shift to just one company, because again, you're trying to change an entire industry to use one company's, keep that in mind, one company's specific website. How many different companies, big companies, are involved with podcasts that are doing things for podcasting in the traditional sense? I can think of 4 off the bat: Blueberry, Libsyn, Podbean, and Pinecast, right? Like those are some mainstream names, and they're following traditional podcasting. You're never going to get all your consumers to head over to Saycaster. It's not going to happen. That's my opinion.
Yeah, and we see this over and over again. So if something important pops up, we'll definitely tell you to make sure that you can take advantage of it as a hobby podcaster, just like I did earlier. And I said, if you're not on iHeartRadio and Spotify, you probably should get on those. And I also said, while you shouldn't ignore the smart home speakers, you don't need to focus on it. I mean, if you can't get to it for a couple of months, don't worry about it. But the big thing is iHeartRadio and Spotify there, just to make sure you're available, because that's where people are streaming.
Yeah. So there you go. If you want to check out something new, saycaster.com. But what do you have to say about your cast or our cast? I loved this tweet that came our way this week. We had from Gonna Geek Network member Amos, who is part of the Undaunted podcast at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. He said a question for at Stargate Pioneer and at Stephen John Drew of at Better Pod. Let's be honest, he was trying to get us to retweet, which we did. He said, if you could choose anyone alive to perform a vocal introduction to any of your podcasts, whom and why? Mine, at Lynn_Manuel, at David Diggs, introducing at Ridgewell Misery in the style of Hamilton and Lafayette. How do you say it? Lafayette. Lafayette. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, it's that Canadian thing. We had an interesting resulting conversation that came, including from at Instructor Matt. Sorry, it's at Instructor_Matt. Get that underscore. He said, in a world where I need a voiceover artist for my podcast, I travel back in time and hire Don LaFontaine.
You can't read it like that. You got to read it like that. Wait, this is how you got to read it. And I'm sick. So this is in a world where I need a voiceover artist for my podcast, I travel back in time and hire Don LaFontaine.
Took the bait so bad, SP, so bad. You're so predictable.
And now I won't be able to talk for the rest of the podcast.
Again, you took the bait. We also had Shannon Cross say, Don is a legend indeed. I must say, though, at Real West Shall has a great voice, too.
I think it's West Hall.
West Shall
Oh my gosh. Lafayette was, whatever. Dami Ploki also responded and he said, I would pick at Carrie Sdow. So lots of different things. And oh, by the way, if you're interested in what Better Podcasting would want for our voiceover artist, it's at Sithwitch. Yes, that's Lauren from Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. She's also an accomplished voiceover artist, narrator on audiobooks. And believe it or not, she was podcasting before I owned a microphone. And I would have to check, but she might have been podcasting before you, Stephen.
I don't believe so.
It's close. It's close.
Are you sure about that?
Quantum Tavern, yeah.
Maybe it might be. Who knows? I don't know. I'm not an old guy like you old oldies. Also, we had at Damien the DM in an unrelated Twitter tweet send us saying quite an interesting change of pace in your last episode, but I still found it to be quite informative and still very relevant to podcasting as a whole. Damien, thanks so much for that, because we talked about it last show. We mentioned that it was a bit of a change of pace, and we wanted to know what people thought about that. So thank you very much, Damien, for chiming in on that.
We also had Flash and Harley from At Tomorrow's Legends. Oh, Flash and Harley, by the way, is not the real name of the At Tomorrow's Legends, but that is what is on the Twitter account. So that's what we're going to say right here. Flash and Harley said, at Better Pod, in regards to your last episode, this may go against some of what you said, but in buying podcast gear, buy the best you can afford. Don't ever cheap out. It'll cost more in the long run. And if you keep having to upgrade, and I will put in here parentheses, or replace, due to poor quality gear, buy higher end, it lasts longer. Stephen, I believe this is what we've been saying since episode 0, but I could be mistaken. Help me out here.
No, I think that you should always go and buy the $10 microphone, just the $10 microphone, and or maybe just get a Yeti and shove it in the middle of a table. So that's what you should do.
Yeah, watch what kind of advice you get on Reddit, by the way. But yes, thank you very much for pointing this out. We haven't said this in a while. We didn't say it last week because it wasn't the focus of the episode last week. But yes, we do agree. Buy the best quality gear that you can afford.
I do want to say on the flip side, though, I think that you don't want to get in the habit of just buying and launching. I think it's very important that you get recording. I think that's a very important thing. We've talked about that too on here. In fact, we had a whole series of episodes on getting you to stop doing that. So it's important to buy the best that you can at that time, but look at it as a whole. So if something's going to cost you $50, or you can afford to go up to $70, and the $70 is going to give you better quality in the long run, try to do that. But don't sit there and think that you need $5,000 worth of gear just to launch your podcast. Get yourself an Audio-Technica AT2005 or an ATR 2100 and just get going. So those are proven devices.
I'll give you an example of somebody that did similar. I would say just as that, but you left out one. And we're talking about Heather Welsh, who, by the way, thank you very much for having us on the Sunshine Summit 2018. Yes. It was a phenomenal week. I actually watched all of the live streams, maybe not live, but I did watch them later. It was a phenomenal week, Heather. You did great. And she's only been podcasting for 7 months. And this is how she did it. This is what's important to this tweet. She bought herself a Samsung Q2U, and that's all the gear she had. And she started, and she's got a phenomenal podcast right now.
Was it a Samsung Q2U or a Samsung? Because I think you said Samsung.
I might have, and I'm sick, so leave me alone. I'm medicated.
I'm just doing that so we don't get the angry emails. That's all.
Okay, Samsung, SAMSON Q2U.
We also had at Cybercast say, LOL at your app praising hashtag Overcast. I didn't want to use the hashtag, but I will. And its new features. I use Podcast Addict on Android, and it's had most of those features for 3 years already. Just like Android phones are superior to Apple, so are their apps. Cybercast, number one. I actually need to get into Podcast Addict because I've only used Pocket Cast and Beyond Pod, so I should check that out for sure. That's cool. My big point with it last time was that it was just nice to see somebody changing, because it is something that is a fairly big app on Apple. And so I think it still is noteworthy because there is still as an industry, a large amount of Apple users. So I think that changes within Apple are very relevant. With that said, I am a very proud and happy Android user. I quite like my Pixel 2, love my Pixel, love my Moto X, love my Nexus 5. I think that was it. And I will just say that Android phones are not superior to Apple, and Apple phones are not superior to Android. I will say that every person's preference is different, and that some people are better with Android and some people are better with Apple. So there you go. There's your annual time that Steven defends Apple. It's not going to happen again.
Wait a minute. You defended Apple earlier this year. That's twice in 1 year.
One per show. It was Gonna Geek show I defended Apple.
Is there some serious health issue with you going on that I need to know about?
Yeah, I'm a robot.
Well, that's true. Okay. So there was also a poll. We talked about polls earlier in the episode. We actually also released a poll, and it was both of us that released this, said that knowing your podcast's audience is important while creating your content. The following poll choice best describes how well I know my listeners. So coming in at 0% was listeners took a survey. So y'all ain't taking advantage of the whole survey thing. So maybe that's something that you need to do. So 17% of you said created a listener avatar. Now, we're not talking about the movie Avatar or your avatar that you use on Twitter, but this is a representation of what your audience is. And if you haven't done that, it might be good for you to do that just so you know what you're planning to do when you're creating some content. 33% of you said other, reply with an answer, and we did get some answers back from that. And then 50% of you said met listeners in person. I've done this before. I've met listeners all over the United States at different events. And it's never, well, in one case, it wasn't my podcast. I was participating in a meetup of another podcast, but I have met my listeners at different conventions or events throughout the United States. And it's always a joy to meet listeners. And sometimes when I'm traveling for work, I'll say, hey, I'm in this city. Go ahead. And if you're here, why don't we try to meet up one night? That sort of thing. It's always a fun time to meet up with listeners. So 50% said they met listeners in person. That's actually pretty good.
That is. And finally, in our actual feedback that we'll be reading out is a email from loyal listener Johnny Pennington that we mentioned earlier. Now, here's the thing. We know Johnny Pennington. And so one thing we know about Johnny Pennington, because we've taken the time to get to know Johnny Pennington, is he prefers Stargate Pioneer to read out emails. He thinks that he does a really good job, and I agree. I think SP does a phenomenal job reading things out. However, today, Johnny Pennington, SP is sick, and I will not make him do your your wonderful email. So let me give my best Stargate Pioneer impersonation here. I like media hosting. Yep, checks out. All right, we had, hey guys, I just finished. Oh, by the way, the title of this was Something Odd is Happening. Hey guys, I just finished watching your Better Podcast episode 122 for the second time. The first time was the live stream recording of it last Wednesday. What's really odd is that while watching your live stream and being mesmerized by Steven's new electronic Gonna Geek mic flag built by Steven's brother David John Drew, aka the Better John Drew, my wife happened into the room. She seemed to notice how intently I gazed into its simulated pulsing antenna transmissions. She called my name once or twice, but I didn't respond. I was just enthralled with that lighted, pulsating mic flag. Then I did hear her repeating a few times, "You're getting sleepy. You're getting sleepy." I must have been, because the next thing I know, I woke up wearing an apron while standing at the sink in the kitchen. The dishes were all clean, the carpet was vacuumed, and now washed clothes were folded in a basket beside me. Concerned, I looked for my wife, but decided not to disturb her as I found her fast asleep on the couch with the biggest contented looking smile on her face. Since I didn't remember your entire episode, I decided to watch the whole thing over again, and darn, I know it's hard to believe, but as I was gazing into Steven's new pulsating mic flag again, the same thing happened. I was suddenly in the kitchen, in an apron, finishing up the dishes. The carpet was vacuumed, and now washed clothes were folded in a basket beside me. Anyways, I just wanted to give you a heads up in case your episode 122 episode number spiked. It's just me trying to make it through the whole show. Thanks, guys. Johnny Pennington. So yes, if you didn't check this out last time, you definitely should check it out at betterpodcasting.com/122 or betterpodcasting.com/123. And you'll see that we do have a new, I have a new addition, and it is an electronic microphone flag. And it was something that my brother made. So if you want to check that out, you'll see it on future shows. And yes, there is pulsating waves, as Johnny mentioned, which can be turned on or turned off. So just, if we ever want to break that little trance that you're in, I'll just shut it off.
What's going on?
Yeah. Audio listeners, SP was mesmerized by my mic flag. Johnny, thanks so much for sending that email. We do sincerely appreciate it. And as always, funny. And finally, before we do conclude the show, SP, you had a special shout out you wanted, right?
I did. Over on Reddit, I actually had a civilized conversation regarding the Blue Yeti with the Dad-IO podcast. And that was a fun, civilized conversation back and forth. He understood what I was saying from a technical perspective. I was understanding what he was doing, and I was able to help him out, actually, because I listened to his show through my monitors, and which is the good speakers that you can get when you're mixing in a studio. And I found some issues with his show, so I was able to tell him. And the thing is, I don't think it was Blue Yeti related. It's a Blue Yeti Pro, and I think it was like line noise throughout his system that he wasn't be able to monitor. So lesson learned from that, make sure you're monitoring your recording while you're editing, just to make sure that there's nothing happening in the background. Learn how to post-process for noise reduction, and you can get decent audio from a Blue Yeti. We still don't recommend it because there's so much that can go wrong with a condenser microphone for a hobby podcaster that's recording in a home environment in an untreated audio environment. That's the conversation we had back and forth. So while I applaud his efforts and it was a good sounding show overall, we don't recommend a condenser microphone in general for hobby podcasters.
Agreed. But, I think it's always great to have these conversations, especially if people can be rational like the two of you were. That's the key. And I think if as society we were a little more rational with these discussions, we could understand things a little bit better in different people's perspectives and really help each other out. We're a very friendly community. And I think that rational conversations like the one that you had with him is very, very, very helpful and beneficial to everybody reading it. So there you go. That's the end of episode 123. If you've not listened to previous episodes, you can find the full back catalog at betterpodcasting.com. And while you're there, click on over to the Gonna Geek Network at gonnageeknetwork.com and check out all of the other amazing geeky shows. For episode 123 of Better Podcasting, I'm Stephen John Drew saying you are getting sleepy. Very sleepy.
And I'm SP saying, Steven, if you try to hypnotize me again, those drones are coming for you, buddy.
Subscribe to betterpodcasting.com. Bye.
See you guys next time.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Better Podcasting. We want to hear from you. You can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. If you like the show, please consider giving us a 5-star review in iTunes. We encourage you to check out all of the other geeky podcasts available at gonnageeknetwork.com. This has been a Gonna Geek production. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again next week.